Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of the most dangerous, most paranoid, and most quietly devastating corners of the American experience. The world of the fentanyl dealer in the 2020s. Not the cartel bosses on television with the leather chairs and the private jets. Not the kingpin with a name. The guy below all of that. The guy standing on a corner in a city you've probably driven through, holding a product that is roughly 100 times more potent than morphine, selling it to people whose names he knows, in a country that has decided the best response to an overdose epidemic is to make sure someone goes to prison. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what we do here. And if you have a topic you'd love to see covered, drop it in the comments. A genuine thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. You know who you are. Your suggestions are what keep this channel alive and moving in directions we'd never find on our own. We're also on Spotify now, by the way. Link is in the description if you'd rather let this one wash over you in the dark like the deeply comforting nightmare it is. Alright, dim those lights. Put a fan on if you got one. Get horizontal. Pull something warm over you. And let yourself wonder for a moment. Have you ever thought about what it actually takes to sell fentanyl in the 2020s? Like the logistics of it? You'd assume there's an app for that, but there kind of is, and that's somehow worse. What does it feel like to weigh out a substance so potent that a speck of it the size of a few grains of salt can kill a grown adult? How do you explain your income to your family, your girlfriend, the IRS? Do you Google your customers after they stop texting? Do you have regulars? Do you have something that functions like a sense of customer service? Do you have a favourite burner phone brand? And what happens when your supplier changes the formula without telling you, and 3 people who trusted you don't wake up the next morning? Congratulations. You've just woken up in America, 2022. The year fentanyl officially became the leading cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 45. Your phone has 7 unread messages. 2 of them are orders. 1 of them is from someone you haven't heard from in a while, and you already know what that silence meant. Welcome to the job. Let's start at the beginning, which almost never begins where people expect. You didn't grow up wanting this. Nobody's career day presentation was titled Pharmaceutical Distribution in the Informal Economy. But here's what actually happens. The pipeline into street-level fentanyl dealing in the 2020s is paved with the exact same materials as every other bad decision in American history: poverty, proximity, and a shortage of better options. For most people at this level of the supply chain, the entry point wasn't ambition. It was geography. You grew up in a neighbourhood where this was already happening, where someone older and slightly more comfortable than everyone else around them was doing it, and where the math was hard to argue with. A few $100s in a single afternoon versus a shift at a warehouse that pays $12 an hour and makes your back feel like it's filing for bankruptcy. The decision isn't made with excitement. It's made with a kind of exhausted pragmatism. The same way people decide to skip the doctor because the copay is $300. You don't leap into this life. You slide into it slowly, and then one day you look up and you're already in it. You were probably around 17, give or take, the first time the idea became concrete rather than abstract. Before that it was theoretical, the kind of thing you knew existed the way you knew calculus existed. A real thing in the world that didn't yet apply to you. Then something shifted. Maybe someone you went to school with came up, changed, started dressing differently, and it wasn't a secret why. Maybe your family hit a wall, the kind of wall that a specific amount of money would have solved, and you knew where that money was available, and you sat with that knowledge for a few weeks before doing anything about it. Maybe you were already adjacent to it through someone else's operation, and the transition from proximity to participation felt less like a decision and more like a natural next step. The specific trigger varies by person. The underlying structure is remarkably consistent. Here's the thing about the life that nobody who hasn't been in it fully understands from the outside. The entry isn't dramatic. There's no initiation, no ceremony, no moment where someone hands you a rule book and explains the organizational hierarchy. You don't sign anything. You don't take an oath. You simply start doing a thing that you know carries serious consequences in a way that feels less terrifying than it should because the people around you have been doing it without obvious catastrophe, at least so far, at least from where you're standing. The catastrophe is there. You just can't see all of it yet because the consequences of this life are not evenly distributed across time. They cluster at the back end, which is a feature of the business model that happens to also be very effective at recruiting people into it. The neighborhood itself is a character in this story. The particular geography of American poverty in the 2020s creates conditions that aren't random. They're the accumulated result of decades of disinvestment, of housing policy and school funding and job market shifts, and the specific ways that the war on drugs has extracted men from communities and returned them changed or not at all. You grew up knowing people who went away and came back different. You knew what happened to people who got caught, and you knew what happened to people who never got into this at all, who stayed completely clean, who did everything right, and you watched what the job market offered them, and you did the math on their lives too. The calculation is not as simple as outside observers tend to assume. It never is. The people who study drug market entry points talk about what they call social network proximity, which is a polished academic way of saying that you sell drugs because people who sell drugs are in your life. That's it. That's the primary predictor. Not moral failing, not some deficiency of character or ambition or family values. Proximity. The same dynamic that makes people go into medicine because their parents are doctors, or go into finance because their college roommate went into finance. Humans do what the people around them do, adjusted for the rewards and risks available in their specific environment. The rewards in this environment are real. The risks are enormous and mostly deferred. And so, here you are. The honest version of this entry story doesn't have a villain, or rather it has several villains, and none of them are you, and none of them are the person who handed you your first package and said, "Be careful." The villains are systems, policies, historical decisions made in rooms you were never in by people who would never have to live with the consequences the way you do. That's a hard thing to hold on to when you're in it. It's a hard thing to find useful on a practical level when the immediate facts of your situation require immediate attention. But it's true, and it's part of the complete accounting of how this begins for almost everyone it begins for. Before you understand what it means to sell fentanyl, you need to understand what fentanyl actually is, because the gap between what most people think they know and what the reality is sits somewhere between uncomfortable and genuinely terrifying. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid, meaning it doesn't come from poppies the way heroin does. It's built in a laboratory, designed in the 1960s by a Belgian pharmacist named Paul Janssen, and introduced to medicine as an anesthetic so powerful that it made morphine look like an afternoon nap. Pharmaceutical fentanyl is real and legitimate. It lives in patches, lozenges, and hospital V-lines, and when used in controlled medical settings with trained professionals and monitoring equipment and crash carts nearby, it is genuinely life-saving. What's on the street is something else entirely. Illicit fentanyl, much of it manufactured in laboratories in China and Mexico, and pressed into pills or cut into powders, operates on a scale of potency that requires you to change how you think about dosing. We're talking about a substance where the difference between a high and a fatal overdose can be measured in micrograms, not milligrams. Micrograms. 1 microgram is 1,000th of a milligram. The margin is essentially invisible to the naked eye, which means every transaction at the street level is, in a very literal sense, a game of Russian roulette, where the cylinder only has a few chambers and your customer is spinning it. To put that potency in terms that make intuitive sense, A lethal dose of fentanyl can be as small as 2 milligrams, which is roughly the size of a few grains of table salt. You could place it on your fingertip and not feel its weight. You could drop it and lose it against a kitchen counter. It's not a big thing. It's an almost invisible thing that will stop a grown adult's breathing within minutes if it enters their bloodstream in the wrong way at the wrong dose. This is not a drug that allows for casual imprecision. This is a drug that punishes imprecision with death, consistently, predictably, at a scale that has no modern American parallel. The opioid mechanism matters here because it explains why people pursue it despite knowing this. Opioids work by binding to receptors in the brain that regulate pain, reward, and breathing. The same system that makes an opioid effective at managing surgical pain is the system that creates the wave of warmth and relief and absence that people with opioid dependence describe as the thing they're chasing. That sensation is real. It is pharmacologically genuine. It's not a choice to feel it. It's what happens when this category of drug hits those receptors. The problem is that the receptors associated with the high are in your limbic system. The receptors associated with breathing are in your brainstem. And fentanyl binds to both, indiscriminately at the same time. Too much, and the brainstem just turns the breathing off, quietly and without drama, while the limbic system is still deep in the warmth of it. People fall asleep and don't wake up, they don't struggle. There's no alarm, there's just a person who was alive and is now not. You know this. If you've been in this market for any amount of time, you know this in a detailed and specific way, because you've seen what it looks like. You know the colour someone's lips turn. You know the sound of breathing that has slowed past the point where correction is easy. You've either personally administered naloxone or you've been close to someone who has, and you've watched someone come back from the edge of that in a way that is not poetic or cinematic, but biological and startling and somehow ordinary now, because it has happened enough times that it occupies a regular compartment in your experience. The product you sell has this quality built into it, not as an accident, not as a flaw in a batch, but as a fundamental feature of what the molecule does to the human body at certain concentrations. You live with that. You carry it. And every time you put product in someone's hand, it's in the room with you whether you acknowledge it or not. The pharmaceutical version of this story includes doctors and hospitals and monitoring equipment and reversal agents kept nearby. None of that infrastructure exists in the street market. There is no crash cart. There is no anesthesiologist watching your levels. There is no one whose job is to keep the dose in the therapeutic window. There is you, your product, your customer, and the pharmacology, which does not make exceptions. Here's what the news doesn't fully explain when it talks about fentanyl. The dealer on the corner did not synthesize this. He did not order precursor chemicals from a lab in Sichuan province. He did not press the pills. He didn't even see the pills before they were already pills. The supply chain for illicit fentanyl in the 2020s is a genuinely global operation that runs through several distinct layers before it touches the hands of anyone doing retail-level business. At the top you have chemical manufacturers, primarily in China, who produce either finished fentanyl or the chemical precursors used to synthesize it. These flow, largely through shipping containers and international mail, to Mexico, where the major cartels, chiefly the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel, have built large-scale manufacturing operations. The cartels press the fentanyl into pills designed to mimic legitimate pharmaceuticals, particularly 30 milligram oxycodone tablets, with the M logo on one side and the 30 stamped on the other, what the street calls blues, or M30 Fenta pills. These move north across the border in enormous quantities, distributed into American cities through wholesale networks, then broken down into smaller and smaller quantities as they pass through multiple hands. By the time it reaches your hands, you may be the fourth or fifth person to hold it. you know almost nothing about where it came from, and that ignorance is not accidental, it's structural. The cartel logistics that move fentanyl across the border are sophisticated in ways that consistently outpace enforcement efforts designed to intercept them. The product is compact. A kilogram of fentanyl enough to press into millions of pills, takes up approximately the volume of a hardcover novel. It passes through ports of entry in cars, trucks, and on people's bodies. It moves through the mail in quantities small enough to evade detection, hidden inside machinery, food products, clothing, and ordinary consumer goods. The DEA seizes enormous quantities every year, enough to generate press releases about record-breaking hauls, and the market does not noticeably constrict. The volume is simply that large. Once the product enters the United States at the wholesale level, it moves through a distribution structure that varies significantly by city and region. In some markets, the cartel maintains a direct operational presence through trusted regional distributors. In others, independent American traffickers buy at the wholesale level and manage their own downstream networks. In most American cities, by the time the product reaches the retail level, it has passed through at least 2 or 3 intermediary hands, each taking a margin, each introducing an additional layer of opacity about the product's origin, composition, and actual potency. This is the supply chain that you, at the bottom of it, are largely working with. What you know about your supply is limited by design. Your connection, the person you buy from, may give you a name for the product and a description of the expected quality, and that information is partly a sales pitch and partly genuine, and you have almost no way to verify which portion is which. Fentanyl test strips, which can detect the presence of fentanyl in a sample, have become more widely available through harm reduction organizations, and in some states have been decriminalized specifically to allow their use. Some dealers use them, most don't, either because of cost, logistics, or the friction of adding a step to a transaction that they prefer to keep simple and fast. The result is that you are regularly handling a product whose potency you cannot verify, at the concentration that matters most, which is the concentration at the level of the individual pill or bag that your customer is going to use tonight. There's another layer to the supply chain story that matters in the 2020s, which is the emergence of fentanyl analogues, chemical relatives of fentanyl that are structurally similar but technically distinct, developed originally to evade legal scheduling. Carfentanil, which is a fentanyl analogue used as a large animal tranquilizer, is estimated to be roughly 100 times more potent than fentanyl itself. It has appeared in American drug supplies: acetylfentanyl, butyrylfentanyl, furanylfentanyl. The list of analogues is long, and the potency variation between them is enormous. Your supplier may not know which analogue is in a given batch. Their supplier may not know either. The information degrades as it moves down the chain. By the time it reaches the end user, what they're holding may have a chemical identity that nobody in the chain can name with certainty. The supply chain is deep and dark, and the product at its end is powerful and inconsistent in a combination that produces the specific catastrophe the 2020s have been documenting at a rate of hundreds of deaths per day. The first time you actually sell something, it's almost never to a stranger. That's a myth built by crime dramas where dealers operate like independent contractors with business cards. In reality, the first sale almost always happens inside an existing relationship. A friend needs something. A cousin puts you in touch with someone. Someone in your building already knows you have access. There's a shorthand that develops between people in the same economic and social radius. A kind of quiet knowledge about who has what and who can be trusted not to bring problems to your door. The transaction itself is often awkward in a way that's hard to describe without having been there. There's no ceremony, no dramatic exchange, no slow-motion money-changing hands while a meaningful song plays. It's a brief conversation, a price established either verbally or by gesture, an exchange that takes maybe 30 seconds, and then it's over. The money's in your hand, the product is in someone else's, and now you've crossed something you can't uncross. The interesting thing, the thing that people on the outside find hard to understand, is that the weight of that moment is not usually what you'd expect. It doesn't feel like a movie. It feels like nothing in particular, or maybe like a very mild version of the anxiety you get when you lie to someone and it works. The weight comes later, usually in the middle of the night, usually much later than you expected. The first few transactions happen within a specific social radius that provides a kind of insulation from the more dangerous features of the market. You're not dealing with strangers, you're dealing with people who have a relationship with you that pre-exists this transaction and would be damaged by a bad outcome. This provides some protection on both sides. They're not going to rob you, you're not going to let them take bad product. There's a social contract layered underneath the commercial one, and for a while that social contract does some work. What it doesn't do is prepare you for when the circle expands, because it always expands. The expansion happens incrementally and feels natural at the time. Someone you sold to mentions you to someone they know, someone outside the original circle. They vouch for you, and you vouch for the product, and the new customer reaches out through the same social connection. You're now 1 degree removed from a stranger, which is not the same as dealing with a stranger, but it's also not the same as the original contained world of known people. Then that person mentions you to someone 2 degrees out, and so on. The circle widens while you're focused on the transactions themselves, and at some point you realize you're operating a thing that has momentum and scale that you didn't specifically choose to create. The logistical education that happens in the early weeks is rapid and informal. You learn by doing and by watching, and by making small mistakes that cost you money rather than large mistakes that cost you something else. You learn that the way you answer the phone matters, that the way you describe a meetup matters, that taking too long to respond to a message costs you customers to whoever responds faster, that the specific time of day when things move fastest is not random, but follows the rhythms of addiction and paycheck cycles and the particular clock of the neighborhood you're working in. None of this is written down. None of it is taught in any formal sense. It accumulates in you as experience, filed under things you know now that you didn't know before, along with a growing sub-file of things you wish you still didn't know. The money from those first transactions is real in a way that feels almost embarrassing in its simplicity. You hold it, and it's just money, the same as any other money, and it spends exactly the same way, and there's a period early on where the cognitive dissonance between the gravity of what you're doing and the ordinariness of the result is something you're aware of but don't examine too closely. The examination comes later. For now, there's just the money and the next transaction and the sense of being inside something that is moving forward. There's a persistent cultural image of the fentanyl customer that looks a lot like a specific kind of person in a specific kind of neighborhood, and that image is both politically loaded and factually inaccurate. The reality of who buys fentanyl in the 2020s is far more expansive, more demographically varied, and more heartbreaking than the stereotype. Yes, street-level fentanyl moves heavily in low-income urban areas, but it also moves in suburbs, in rural counties, in the parking lots of businesses in zip codes that have school board elections and well-funded youth soccer leagues. The opioid epidemic didn't wait for a demographic invitation. The customer base that emerged in the 2020s includes people who started on prescription opioids after a surgery or an injury, got cut off when prescribing guidelines tightened, and found that the street was cheaper and more accessible than a pain management clinic. It includes people who thought they were buying something else and got fentanyl without knowing. It includes people in long-term addiction who've been cycling through treatment and relapse for years. What they share is not a look or a neighborhood. What they share is the physiology of opioid dependence, which is the same in every zip code in every body, regardless of who you voted for or what your parents expected of you. For the person selling, this breadth of customer is not abstract. These are people with faces and names and text message histories. Some of them have been buying from you for months. Some of them you grew up with. The customer you see most often, the one who represents the largest portion of your daily transactions, is someone in active opioid dependence. That means their body has adapted to the presence of opioids and will produce withdrawal symptoms in their absence. Withdrawal from opioids is not fatal for most people the way alcohol withdrawal can be, but it is genuinely terrible. Nausea, vomiting, muscle cramping, sleeplessness, a quality of distress that people who've experienced it describe as feeling like dying even when they aren't. This is not a metaphor, it's a pharmacological reality, and it means that your regular customer's need for what you're selling is not casual. It's urgent in a way that has nothing to do with wanting to feel good and everything to do with the body's demand to maintain its chemical baseline. Understanding this changes how you understand the transaction. You're not just selling a product people enjoy, you're selling a product that, for a significant portion of your customers, is the thing that allows them to function at all in the short term. Get through the day, get to work if they're still working, not be sick. This reality puts you in a position of power over other people's bodies that is significant and uncomfortable, and doesn't simplify easily. Some dealers hold this with a detachment that serves as a kind of operational protection. Others don't, and the ones who don't carry their customers differently, as people with names and histories and children, and the particular flavour of bad luck that each person's path into opioid dependence represents. The new user is a different kind of heartbreak. They exist in your customer base in smaller numbers, but represent a category of risk that is distinctly modern. This is the person who doesn't have a tolerance, who used recreationally once or twice and is experimenting with something they've been told is a version of a painkiller, who doesn't know their product contains fentanyl because what they bought was represented as something else, who uses a dose calibrated for someone with a high tolerance, and whose respiratory system has never encountered this molecule before. For this customer, the first experience might be the last experience. The DEA documented thousands of deaths in the 2020s from first or near-first exposures to counterfeit pills containing fentanyl. These are people who are not addicted, who had not made a sustained lifestyle choice, who simply encountered a product at a party or through a friend and died before they got to make a second decision about it. The weight of this particular customer, the non-dependent, the occasional user, the person who didn't even know they were buying fentanyl, is the part of this work that takes the heaviest psychological toll on the people who carry any portion of conscience into it. Because you cannot know, at the point of sale, which category your customer falls into. You cannot know their tolerance. You cannot know what else they've taken. You cannot know if they're going to use alone, which is where most overdose deaths happen, or with someone who will call for help or administer naloxone. You're making a transaction with incomplete information, and the gap in that information is filled sometimes by someone dying. In the 2020s, the operational infrastructure of a street-level fentanyl dealer fits in one pocket. It's a phone. Usually a cheap prepaid device, often called a trap phone or a burner, bought with cash from a gas station or a dollar store, registered to no one, containing no identifying information, and used for one purpose. All communication runs through it. Orders come in via text. Prices are rarely written out. A whole vocabulary of shorthand, emojis, and coded language is developed to make conversations legible to the participants and opaque to anyone reading over their shoulder, including law enforcement. The standard understanding among experienced dealers is that you cycle phones frequently, dropping one every few weeks, or whenever something feels off, and starting fresh with a new number. The problem is that discipline decays over time. People get comfortable. They use the same phone too long. They text more explicitly than they should. They call from the trap phone to their actual contacts, creating a connective thread that investigators can follow. Law enforcement in the 2020s has become genuinely skilled at phone forensics, at pulling contact graphs from seized devices, at building cases from a series of text messages that look innocuous individually and devastating collectively. The phone is simultaneously the most important tool in this business and the most common reason it ends badly. The volume of messages on a working trap phone in a given day is significant. Depending on the scale of your operation and the pace of your market, you might handle dozens of incoming inquiries between morning and midnight. The management of those inquiries, responding quickly enough to not lose the sale, slowly enough to not be reckless, coordinating times and places that are operationally sound, is a job in itself. It requires a kind of sustained divided attention that over time becomes its own kind of cognitive load. You're never fully off. The phone is always in your awareness even when you're not actively managing it, because it's always potentially active. The coded language that has developed around drug transactions in the era of digital communication is genuinely creative and also not nearly as impenetrable as the people using it tend to believe. Law enforcement agencies that work drug cases have documented vocabularies. They've built glossaries. A reference to a certain number of tickets, or a colour, or a basic transaction framing that's slightly off from a normal commercial exchange reads to an experienced investigator the same way it reads to the person it was intended for. The code isn't secure, it's just slower to decode than plain text. And the additional layer of complexity in the 2020s is that messages don't disappear unless you make them disappear deliberately, and even then, fragments often survive in ways you didn't anticipate. Backup logs, carrier records, the devices of the people you sent to. The physical management of the phone has its own rituals. You keep it separate from your personal phone. You don't let people who don't need to touch it. You're thoughtful about where you use it because cell towers log which towers your device pinged, creating a movement record of your phone through the city over time. An investigator who pulls those tower records can show, with reasonable precision, that your device was in the same location as a suspected transaction site, at the same time the transaction is alleged to have taken place. This is basic technology that has been available to investigators for years and is used routinely in federal drug prosecutions. Most people doing this at the street level know it exists in a general way. Fewer people exercise the consistent discipline that protecting against it would require. New platforms have shifted parts of this communication underground in the 2020s. Encrypted messaging apps with disappearing messages, apps that route through servers in jurisdictions less cooperative with American law enforcement. These add layers of protection that a basic SMS exchange doesn't provide. But they also require your customers to use the same platforms, which narrows your accessible market, and they require a level of technical literacy and operational consistency that not everyone maintains under the actual conditions of daily operation. The phone remains the central hub, the most vulnerable element, and the thing most likely to be in the room when the door comes open. Ask most people what they imagine a drug dealer makes and they'll describe something involving large amounts of cash, probably stored in a creative location. The reality of street-level fentanyl economics in the 2020s is considerably less cinematic. The margins at the bottom of the supply chain are not what they appear. A gram of illicit fentanyl bought from a mid-level distributor might cost somewhere between a few hundred and a few $1,000s, depending on the city, the purity and the relationship involved. That same gram pressed into counterfeit pills selling for $10 to $30 each, or cut into small bags sold for a similar price, might generate several times that on paper. But paper revenue and actual income are separated by a series of costs that don't appear in the glamorized version of this story. There's the cost of the product itself, the cost of the phones, the cost of any housing or transportation used, the cost of dealing with losses from customers who don't pay, which is both a financial problem and a complicated social one, because your options for enforcement are limited and mostly terrible. The cost of supply interruptions, which happen regularly and unpredictably, and the cost that every person in this business eventually pays in one form or another: legal exposure, health exposure, and the kind of psychological overhead that doesn't have a line item but extracts from you constantly. Many people doing this at the street level are not wealthy. They are surviving, sometimes barely, in the same economic precarity that put them here in the first place. The cash economy that surrounds this business creates its own set of problems beyond the obvious legal ones. You can't deposit it. You can't use it to build credit. You can't put it in an account that generates any return or provides any security. You hold cash, and holding cash is the most fragile form of wealth that exists. It gets stolen. It gets lost. It degrades if stored poorly. It doesn't earn anything. It doesn't compound. And it creates the specific vulnerability of walking around with significant amounts of money in a world where people know or suspect you have significant amounts of money, which is an advertisement for robbery that you cannot turn off. Stash locations are the partial solution. Cash kept somewhere other than on your person, somewhere that provides some protection against the opportunistic robbery, but also creates the problem of having a location that contains something you don't want found. The tax question is one of the grimly ironic features of this life. The IRS requires that you report all income, including income from illegal activities. This is not a joke. It's the actual legal standard, and it's the mechanism that sent Al Capone to prison when direct prosecution for his actual activities proved difficult. In practice, street-level dealers rarely file taxes, which means they accumulate another layer of legal exposure on top of the drug charges. The money that they spend visibly, on cars or clothing or rent, without a documented income source to explain it, creates the paper trail that investigators use to build circumstantial cases around suspected distribution activity. Living below the visible threshold of unexplained expenditure requires a discipline about consumption that conflicts with every social pressure the environment creates to demonstrate your income. Young men in this market face a constant tension between operational security, which counsels invisibility, and social currency, which runs on visible signs of success. The math that draws people in is real and is based on real numbers. A person making $12 an hour working 40 hours a week takes home roughly $19,000 a year after taxes. Someone doing retail-level fentanyl distribution in an active market can generate more than that in a month, in theory, if everything is working. The problem is that everything is never reliably working. Supply interruptions, losses to theft or non-payment, legal expenses when something goes wrong, the cost of periods when you have to go quiet for safety reasons, all of these eat into the theoretical gross. The net, when calculated honestly against all costs including the ones you can't put a number on yet, is often less impressive than the entry-level pitch suggested. But it's still more than minimum wage, which is the relevant comparison for the specific population most likely to be making this decision. That comparison does a lot of work. There's a geography to how street-level dealing organises itself in domestic space, and it's not what television has sold you. You're not in a warehouse. You're not in a stash house that looks like a prop from a film. You're usually in a regular apartment in a regular building, and the ordinariness of the setting is part of what makes it work. The product has to live somewhere. The money has to live somewhere. The phone has to be charged somewhere, and all of that somewhere ends up being a residence, either yours or someone else's, who's been compensated or coerced into allowing it. The apartment takes on a particular character over time. There's a heightened awareness of the door, of the hallway, of who knows the address and who doesn't. Windows that face the street get checked with a frequency that becomes habit. Packages arriving at the wrong time. Neighbours who seem curious. The sound of footsteps in the corridor that pause outside the door and then continue. You learn to read the building the way you'd read a face, looking for signs of something wrong before it announces itself. The space is rarely dramatic. There's usually a television. There might be a couch that's seen better decades. The kitchen smells like whatever someone microwaved, and somewhere, in a location chosen with deliberate thought and a certain dark pragmatism, there's the product, ordinary and catastrophic in the same breath. The question of whose apartment to use is not trivial. Using your own creates direct legal connection between you, the residents, and any product or paraphernalia found there. A search of your apartment, conducted with a warrant or in some circumstances without one, produces evidence that becomes part of a case file. Using someone else's address offers a degree of separation, but it also creates a set of problems that are different in character. It means you're implicating someone else in your operation, either with their knowledge and compensation, which brings them into the legal exposure, or without their full understanding of the risk they're accepting. The legal term for a residence used to store drugs is a stash house, and the federal charges associated with maintaining a drug-involved premises carry their own mandatory minimums, separate from and in addition to the distribution charges. This layering of charges is one of the tools prosecutors use to build leverage in cases where they want information about people higher in the supply chain. Every location in your operational map is a potential charge. Every person whose address you use is a potential co-defendant. The neighbours know more than you want them to. Not necessarily the specifics, but the texture, the traffic, the hours, the visitors who come and go, the particular quality of activity around a residence that signals something is happening without making it explicit. Most neighbours don't report this, and most of the time the reason is not sympathy or solidarity, it's calculation. Calling the police about suspicious activity in your building has consequences for you in a neighbourhood where your relationship with law enforcement is not simple, and where the appearance of having cooperated with police creates its own social and sometimes physical risks. So the neighbours watch, they have opinions, they tell each other, and this creates a kind of ambient knowledge about your operation that exists in the building the way electricity exists in the walls, invisible, present, and capable of causing serious damage under the right conditions. The apartment is also where you come down from whatever it cost you to get through the day. It's where you eat and sleep, if you're sleeping, and try to watch something on a phone or a television that holds your attention enough to give you an hour or two, where you're not thinking about the things you spend most of your day thinking about. There's something almost poignant about the ordinariness of these spaces when you see them in evidence photographs after a case is closed. The dishes in the sink, the shoes by the door, the half-eaten meal on the counter from before things went sideways. The life that was happening in between the other things that were also happening. Both of them real. Both of them happening in the same kitchen. One of the most genuinely terrifying features of the illicit fentanyl market in the 2020s is what's called inconsistent mixing, and it's responsible for a significant portion of the overdose deaths that happen even among experienced users. Here's the problem. Fentanyl is active in such tiny quantities that when it's cut into a larger volume of powder, whether that's a heroin mixture, pressed pills, or something else entirely, it does not distribute evenly. Chemists call this the hotspot problem. Imagine stirring a spoonful of red food, colouring into a bucket of white powder, without mixing it thoroughly. Some portions of that powder will be very red. Others will barely be tinted. Illicit manufacturing does not take place in conditions optimized for consistency. It takes place under time pressure, in conditions designed to avoid detection, with equipment that varies in quality, and with workers who are not always trained chemists. What this means in practice is that a batch of product that tested at one potency in its first quarter might be dramatically stronger in its last quarter. 2 pills pressed from the same batch can contain wildly different amounts of active fentanyl. The customer buys what they believe to be the same thing they bought last week. They use the same amount, and the difference between those 2 amounts is enough to stop their breathing. For the person who sold it, this is a nightmare that arrives without warning, usually by phone, usually late at night, usually in the form of a message that takes a moment to process before the weight of it becomes real. The relationship between supplier and dealer involves a fundamental information asymmetry around product quality that neither party can fully resolve. Your supplier tells you the product is good. This means something, but not everything. Good can mean it tested well on the portion they checked. It can mean the batch they held on to is representative. It can mean the last batch from this supplier was consistent and they're assuming this one is similar. It can also be a sales pitch with no verification behind it at all. You have no way to know which of these is true. You can buy test strips and check the product before you move it, which tells you fentanyl is present but not at what concentration. You can buy a small amount and find a customer willing to test it for quality, which is a transaction with its own terrible ethical implications. Or you can sell it on the information you were given, which is what most people do most of the time, because the market doesn't build in time for quality control and the customers don't wait for lab reports. The cutting agents that accompany fentanyl in the illicit supply vary widely and add their own unpredictability to the product. Fentanyl is typically mixed with inert diluents to bring it to a saleable volume. Sugars, powdered milk, caffeine, quinine. These agents dilute the active compound but can also cause their own adverse reactions in some users, particularly those with underlying health conditions. In the counterfeit pill market, binding agents are added to help the mixture press and hold its shape. These 2 are variable in composition. Xylazine, an animal sedative with no approved human medical use, has been found in fentanyl supplies across the American East Coast and elsewhere, producing overdoses that don't respond to naloxone in the same way pure opioid overdoses do, complicating emergency response in ways that have killed people who otherwise might have been saved. The batch problem has a specific cruelty when it comes to experienced users, because experience creates false safety. Someone who has been using opioids for years has a tolerance that allows them to use amounts that would kill a naive user. That tolerance is calibrated to their previous supply. When a new, stronger batch enters the market without warning, the experienced user applies their established dose to a product they believe is consistent with what they've been using, and the calibration that has protected them fails. This is why a particularly strong batch produces cluster deaths, multiple overdoses in a short window across a supply network, as people who knew what they were doing encounter a product that is different from what they knew in a way nobody told them about. The clusters are traceable in public health data. They're visible as spikes in the mortality curves that epidemiologists watch. From the dealer's side of the transaction, they're visible as a series of messages and silences that arrive in quick succession over a terrible few days. It comes as a text, usually, or a call from a number that shouldn't have your number, which means someone shared it, which is already a problem, but that problem is not what you're processing right now. The message is some version of the same thing. Something happened. Someone isn't responding. Was it yours? The question your brain starts running immediately is not the question you might expect from someone with a conscience, though that question is also there, underneath, growing. The first question is, what does this connect back to? Who knows about the transaction? Is there a text chain? Did anyone see anything? What happens next? And what does it mean for you specifically? This is not sociopathy. This is the survival calculation of someone who has been living inside legal exposure for long enough that risk assessment has become automatic. the way you automatically calculate a route when you hear traffic reported on a road you use. The grief and the calculation happen simultaneously, layered over each other, and neither one cancels the other out. The Centers for Disease Control reported over 100,000 overdose deaths in the United States in 2021 alone, the majority of them involving synthetic opioids. Fentanyl at the top of that list. For the people supplying that market, those aren't statistics. They're sometimes names. Sometimes the face of someone who texted you 2 days ago about something completely unrelated to drugs, something ordinary, something that makes the silence afterward feel heavier in a way that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't felt it. The legal context for the overdose is something that has changed significantly in the 2020s and represents one of the more aggressive evolutions in drug enforcement policy. Fentanyl-related overdose deaths are increasingly being prosecuted as homicides. The theory is distribution of a controlled substance resulting in death, which under federal law carries a mandatory minimum of 20 years. State laws vary, but multiple states have enacted or strengthened drug-induced homicide statutes that allow prosecutors to charge the person who sold the drug to the person who died with their death. In the years between 2018 and 2023, hundreds of these prosecutions were filed across the country. They have produced convictions. They have produced 20-year sentences for people who, by any honest accounting, did not intend to kill anyone. The practical effect of this legal landscape on behavior at the point of an overdose is corrosive in a specific way. If calling 911 after a suspected overdose could result in being charged with a death, the calculation around whether to call is contaminated by legal self-preservation in a way that costs lives. Many states have enacted Good Samaritan laws that provide legal immunity to people who call for help at an overdose scene. But the coverage of these laws is uneven. The awareness of them among people who would need to invoke them is incomplete, and the trust in the legal system required to rely on them is not evenly distributed across the population most likely to be present at an overdose. The result, documented in public health literature, is delayed calls, or no calls at all, at scenes where a faster intervention might have changed the outcome. The grief itself, when it comes, is complicated by the structure of the relationship. You weren't friends in a conventional sense, or maybe you were, but the friendship was organized around a commercial relationship that changed its texture in ways that are hard to untangle after someone is gone. There's guilt, which doesn't require you to have done anything intentionally wrong to arrive and park itself in the middle of your chest. There's the cognitive task of processing that your product, not someone else's, yours, was the last thing in this person's body. That is a specific weight. People carry it differently. Some people's response is to leave the market after the first death. Others stay, and the staying requires a recalibration of the emotional accounting that is not the same as indifference, but that occupies some of the same psychological real estate. You continue, the business continues, and the name of the person who died sits somewhere in the back of it, quietly, attached to nothing in particular, available to surface without warning. Here is something that might surprise you about how law enforcement approaches street-level fentanyl distribution in the 2020s. They often know exactly who's doing it. This is not a mystery to the local narcotics unit. Your name might be in a file. Your phone number might have been flagged from an earlier investigation. A confidential informant, and there are many, because the easiest way to reduce your own sentence is to produce someone else, may have already said your name in a room you'll never see. The reason you haven't been arrested yet is usually one of two things. Either they're building a case upward, meaning you're small enough that you're more useful to them as a thread to pull than as a headline, and they're waiting to see who you lead them to, or they simply don't have the resources because narcotics units in most American cities are understaffed, under-resourced, and triaging constantly between categories of crime and street-level retail fentanyl distribution is not always at the top of the priority list compared to the violence that sometimes surrounds it. This knowledge, that you might already be visible, is its own kind of psychological weight. You can't know for certain. You can never know for certain, which means you operate in a permanent low-grade state of uncertainty that over time reshapes how you move through the world, who you trust, where you go, and what you say out loud. Federal drug enforcement operates differently from local narcotics enforcement, and the distinction matters enormously for anyone in this market. DA investigations are organized around the supply chain rather than the retail sale. A federal task force working a fentanyl case is typically not interested in arresting the person at the bottom. They're using the person at the bottom to climb toward the person who supplied them, and the person who supplied that person. The retail dealer who gets flipped, meaning who agrees to cooperate with investigators, is valuable not because their prosecution is the goal, but because their cooperation is the tool. This is why it sometimes appears that larger players in a drug organization receive lighter sentences than the street-level people beneath them. The larger players were willing to provide more valuable information. The person at the bottom has the least information to trade and pays the highest proportional cost for their position in the organization. Buy-bust operations are the most direct form of retail-level enforcement. An undercover officer or a confidential informant makes a controlled purchase from you, and you're arrested. These operations are used to build evidence for prosecution, and in some cases, as the opening move in an investigation aimed at someone higher up the chain. The controlled buy is documented. The money is marked or recorded. The product is tested. The transaction is observed. The case that results is straightforward from a prosecutorial standpoint. What makes it complicated from your standpoint is that the person who made the buy might have been someone you thought you knew, might have been a regular customer, might have been someone vouched for by someone in your network who was themselves operating under cooperation agreement. The informant economy and the undercover network are designed to be invisible until they aren't, which is the point at which they've already served their purpose. Surveillance technology available to law enforcement in the 2020s extends beyond the phone records and tower data that have been available for years. Automated license plate readers log the movement of vehicles across thousands of locations in American cities, creating searchable records of where a car was and when. CCTV footage from public spaces, private businesses, and residential buildings is increasingly dense in urban environments and increasingly searchable through facial recognition software. Social media, as noted elsewhere, generates enormous volumes of information that is publicly available without a warrant, and is routinely incorporated into investigation files. None of this makes arrest inevitable, but it means that the ambient information available to an investigator building a case around a person is substantially greater than it was in any previous era of drug enforcement, and the assumption that low-profile street activity is invisible to the systems watching it is increasingly an assumption that doesn't hold. The relationship between the dealer and the police at the local community level is not simply adversarial. In neighborhoods where law enforcement has a history of aggressive and racially selective enforcement, the relationship is complex, often toxic, shaped by generations of experience that produce distrust running in both directions. Cooperation with police is socially costly in many of the communities where fentanyl distribution operates. The person who calls 911, who speaks to investigators, who passes information is labelled, and the label carries social and sometimes physical consequences. This dynamic is not an excuse for anything. It's a real structural feature of the environment that shapes behaviour in ways that have nothing to do with whether you personally like or dislike the police. The single most reliable predictor of getting caught in this business is not a surveillance camera or a forensic trace. It's someone you know. The informant economy in American drug enforcement is enormous, deeply entrenched, and extraordinarily effective at dismantling operations from the inside out. The mechanics are straightforward and brutal. Someone in your network gets caught. They're looking at federal charges that carry mandatory minimums measured in decades. A prosecutor sits across from them and makes an offer, information in exchange for consideration. The consideration might be a reduced sentence, a charge dropped, or simply the prosecutor's recommendation to the judge that leniency is appropriate. The person across the table is not a villain in this moment. They are someone who is terrified, who has family, who does not want to spend the next 15 years in a federal facility. The math is not complicated. What this creates at the operational level is a corrosive uncertainty about trust that changes every relationship. Your childhood friend who you've known for 20 years, the cousin you've been working with for months, the person who introduced you to your supplier. Any of them might be in a conversation you don't know about. There's no way to know. There's no test. There's only the behavior of paying attention to changes in how people act around you, to who asks questions they didn't used to ask, to the person who suddenly seems more interested in the specifics of your operation than their own, and treating every anomaly as a signal. The federal informant system is not well understood by most of the public and is one of the more quietly consequential features of American criminal justice. Cooperation agreements come in different forms with different levels of protection. A substantial assistance motion, filed by the prosecutor under the federal sentencing guidelines, can dramatically reduce the sentence of someone who provides substantial cooperation. The cooperation has to produce results: arrests, prosecutions, seizures. Cooperation that doesn't produce these outcomes has less value and generates less consideration. This means the cooperating person is incentivized not just to provide information that is accurate, but to provide information that is actionable, meaning it leads to something the government can use. The structural pressure to produce results can, in cases with unscrupulous participants, produce information that is embellished or fabricated. Federal courts have seen convictions based on informant testimony later found to be unreliable. This is a documented feature of a system that creates enormous incentives without equally enormous safeguards. The social texture of a community where significant informant activity is occurring is distinctive to people who live in it. Trust becomes extremely calibrated. Conversations become selective in their specifics. People who are known or suspected to be cooperating face social consequences that range from ostracism to violence, and the violence is itself a feature of the system. It's a predictable response to a system that creates incentives to inform, which means the system's design generates violence as a byproduct. This is not a new observation. It's been documented by researchers studying drug enforcement for decades and does not appear to have influenced policy significantly in the direction of designing systems with fewer of these byproducts. You navigate this environment by narrowing the circle of people who have operationally relevant information. The principle of need to know is not just organizational hygiene, it's survival. The fewer people who know where your product is stored, who your supplier is, what your volumes are, the fewer points of failure exist in your network. But this principle conflicts with the social reality of operating in a community where relationships are the infrastructure. Your network is also your social world. The people who know about your operation are often the people you're closest to, because closeness and operational proximity are hard to fully separate in this context. So you do the best you can with an imperfect architecture, and you stay alert to the signals that tell you the architecture has been compromised, and sometimes you read those signals correctly and sometimes you don't. The popular narrative about drug market violence frames it as inherent to the product, as though the pharmacology of fentanyl generates conflict the way a pressure cooker generates steam. The actual relationship is more complicated and more sociological. The violence associated with illegal drug markets is not primarily caused by drugs. It's caused by the absence of legal dispute resolution. When a legal business has a contract dispute, they sue. When they have a theft problem, they call the police. When someone defaults on a payment, there's a civil system with remedies. None of that is available in an illegal market, which means the only enforcement mechanism available for debts owed, territory disputes or supply chain disagreements is violence or the credible threat of it. Most of what drives actual violence in fentanyl distribution networks in the 2020s is not addiction, not the drug itself, but the basic organizational problems of running a business with no legal infrastructure. Payments not made, territory encroached upon, product stolen, trust violated. These are mundane commercial disputes that become dangerous because there's no court, no contract, no sheriff to call. The violence is the enforcement mechanism of last resort in a market with no other recourse. And it falls most heavily on the people least insulated from it. The people at the bottom of the supply chain, doing retail, in the most visible positions with the least organizational protection around them. The robbery dynamic is particularly relevant to street-level fentanyl distribution because the product is extremely valuable and extremely portable. A robbery of a dealer requires no specialized skills, produces a high-value outcome, and carries less legal risk than robbing a bank. The person being robbed cannot call the police. The person being robbed cannot pursue legal recourse. This creates a predictable pattern of predatory behavior targeted at street-level dealers, particularly those whose position in the market is known and whose protection infrastructure is limited. The response to robbery risk reshapes how dealers operate. Cash and product are kept in separate locations. Exchanges happen in public spaces where intervention is less likely. Transactions are kept small in volume, and the selection of meeting locations involves an ongoing calculation about visibility and safety that becomes second nature over time. The relationship between fentanyl market activity and homicide statistics is real, but mischaracterized when it's described simply as drug dealers killing each other. Drug market homicides include a significant proportion of victims who are not themselves dealing, who are present at the wrong place and time, who are family members of someone in the market, or who are killed in circumstances where the drug connection was incidental. The collateral damage of drug market violence is not evenly distributed and does not map onto the fictional narrative of violent criminals victimizing each other in a tidy moral circle where no innocent parties are implicated. Real children live in the communities where this happens. Real neighbours sleep near windows that occasionally receive stray rounds. Real families navigate the aftermath of losses that the public record attributes to drug-related violence and then moves past. For you personally, at the retail level of this market, the relationship to violence is primarily defensive. You're more likely to be the target of violence than the initiator of it, because your position at the bottom of the supply chain makes you a resource extraction opportunity for people with fewer scruples and less to lose. The threat isn't abstract. It's part of the calculation of every day. Who knows you have product? Who knows your patterns? Who in your environment would be willing to resolve their economic problems at your expense? These are real questions with real operational implications, and the answer to them shapes your behavior in ways that someone operating in a legal market with legal recourse never has to think about. The job is not just distribution, it's distribution while managing the constant background threat of being robbed, extorted, or worse, by people who understand that you have no safe way to protect yourself. Territory and street-level fentanyl distribution is not as formally marked as in older drug market structures, partly because the market has migrated significantly online, and partly because enforcement pressure keeps organizations more fluid and less static than they used to be. But territory still exists, still matters, and the process by which it's established and maintained is not casual. In practice, territory is less about geography and more about customer networks. The street corner is still a real operational site in some cities, but the more durable currency of territory in the 2020s is relationships. the customers who text your number, the apartment buildings where your name is known, the social networks through which word of mouth operates. Building those networks takes time and generates loyalty, but it also creates conflict when two competing suppliers are after the same customer base. In dense urban markets where multiple operations are running in proximity, the potential for territorial friction is constant. And friction in this context doesn't resolve with a strongly worded email. The cost of defending a customer network against a competitor is paid in stress, paranoia, occasional confrontation, and sometimes in the kinds of outcomes that end up in a police report and then a news brief, and then nothing, because news briefs about this kind of thing have a shelf life measured in hours. The geography of fentanyl distribution in the 2020s is partly physical and partly digital, and the intersection between these two domains creates a territory structure that is different from what older market analysis describes. A phone number is territory. A Snapchat handle is territory. A reputation transmitted through a social network. This person has good product. This person is reliable. This person's stuff is consistent, is territory. These digital and reputational forms of territory can't be claimed by standing on a particular corner. They're built over time through consistent quality, reliable availability, and the kind of interpersonal trustworthiness that, in a market with no consumer protection framework, is the only guarantee a customer has that they won't get robbed or given something dangerous. The process of losing territory is slower and more ambiguous than gaining it. It doesn't usually involve a confrontation and a handover. It involves a gradual erosion. Your customers start buying from someone else because that person came around more reliably, or had better product for a week, or undercut your price at a moment when your supply was disrupted. The response to this erosion depends heavily on resources. If you have organizational backing, you can weather interruptions, maintain pricing, and wait for the disruption to pass. If you're operating independently at the retail level, supply interruptions are existential. They break the reliability that is your primary competitive advantage, and customers who found another source while you were dark don't automatically come back when you're available again. The cost of territorial defense is a drain on everything else. Time spent monitoring competitors, managing frictions, responding to encroachments, is time and energy not spent on anything else. In a business that requires constant operational attention just to keep running normally, the additional overhead of territorial management contributes to the state of sustained high alertness that characterizes this life. You don't get to take a week off. You don't get to unplug. Because the thing you're protecting doesn't hold itself together while you're away. It requires your presence, your attention, and the ambient signal of your continued operation to maintain its value. This is not a business that has weekends. The time cost of territorial maintenance is invisible in the accounting that draws people into this life. The pitch, implicit or explicit, is about money. The reality includes all of the overhead that consumes the time that the money is supposed to compensate for, and territorial maintenance is one of the larger items. You're not just distributing product, you're managing a social geography that has to be actively maintained to remain yours. And the work of that maintenance, the check-ins, the monitoring, the responses to friction, is continuous. This is why the people who do this at scale, who manage larger networks, have other people doing portions of it. The economics of one person's time are insufficient to cover the full operational load. The people at the bottom, operating without that support, do all of it themselves, and the sum of the time it consumes is the actual cost of the business, measured in something more finite and more important than money. Stepping back far enough to see the whole territory, picture produces a kind of vertigo. What you're defending, at enormous personal cost, is a position in a market that is illegal, that carries the risk of decades in prison, that has already cost you people you cared about, and that exists because the conditions that created demand for it have not changed. The territory is real, the costs of defending it are real, and none of that changes what it is, which is a position inside a system that is designed to extract from you and discard you, and which you are working very hard to maintain your place in. The relationship between street-level drug dealing and social media in the 2020s is something that baffles older observers and confounds law enforcement in its brazenness, while simultaneously producing an enormous volume of evidence for prosecutions. The logic of invisibility that governed older drug market operations, keep a low profile, never show cash, never talk to anyone you don't have to, has been in direct tension with the logic of social media since roughly 2012, and the tension has not resolved cleanly. Young men and women operating at the retail level of the fentanyl market are part of a generation that has grown up performing their lives online, and the cultural pressure to demonstrate income, status, and success doesn't disappear because the income source is illegal. Posts showing cash, showing designer goods acquired with that cash, showing a lifestyle that doesn't correspond to any documented employment, have become a significant component of the evidence record in federal drug prosecutions. DEA and local narcotics units routinely monitor social media. Posts are screenshotted, they're time-stamped, they're geotagged, they exist in court exhibits, and the person who posted them usually knew this was possible and posted anyway, because the social pressure of the immediate audience felt more immediate than the abstract risk of the long-term legal audience. This is not stupidity. It's a very human prioritization of the present over the future, but it is also, frequently, devastating. The specific platforms that have become most relevant to fentanyl distribution operations include not just Instagram and Twitter, but encrypted messaging apps like Snapchat, Telegram, and WhatsApp, which offer varying degrees of message security and disappearing content. Snapchat's disappearing message format made it an early favorite for drug market communication because the ephemerality seemed to provide protection. What it actually provides is reduced but not eliminated evidence. Snapchat has responded to law enforcement requests for data in thousands of cases, and while the message content may be gone, the metadata, who communicated with whom, when, how often persists and is producible under subpoena. The gap between how young people in this market understand their digital privacy and the reality of what law enforcement can access is substantial. The perception that encrypted apps provide safety often rests on an incomplete understanding of where the vulnerability lies. The message itself may be encrypted in transit, but the device on which it was sent can be forensically imaged. The account holder's information is held by the platform. The communication pattern is visible at the metadata level, and crucially, if the person you're communicating with has their device seized and forensically examined, your messages are on their device, not protected by your encryption. The security of the channel is only as strong as the weakest device in the conversation. Music and public performance represent a dimension of this dynamic that has produced some genuinely unusual prosecutions. The drill rap scene that emerged from Chicago and spread nationally in the 2010s created a genre in which lyrical content describing drug distribution activity was part of the artistic form. Prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions attempted, with varying success and considerable legal controversy, to introduce rap lyrics as evidence of the specific criminal activity described within them. Courts have divided on this. Critics argue it represents a racially selective application of creative expression as criminal confession that would never be applied to country music artists singing about illegal activities or film directors depicting violence. What it reflects, at minimum, is the way in which the culture of visible self-expression and the culture of operational security exist in fundamental tension for young people navigating both at the same time. The specifically modern problem of the fentanyl dealer's social media presence is that the platform norms and the operational security norms are designed for completely different audiences with completely different risk profiles. Instagram's default settings, Snapchat's interface design, TikTok's algorithmic push toward virality, all of these are built to maximize reach and engagement, which is the exact opposite of what you need. Using these platforms without actively fighting their defaults produces over time a document of your life that you would never have agreed to create if it were described to you in those terms. You didn't consent to building a chronological record of your income, your locations, your associates, and your lifestyle. You were just posting. The distinction is real to you. It does not survive contact with a federal subpoena. The mental model most young people in this market have about their digital footprint underestimates the aggregation problem. Any single post is probably not by itself meaningful evidence. But 20 posts over 6 months considered together describe a pattern, the consistent correlation between your phone's location and a known distribution area, the cash that appears in photos without a corresponding income source, the vehicles, the clothes, the lifestyle markers, the timestamps that place you somewhere at a time that matters. No single data point convicts you. The picture they compose together does. And the picture is being assembled continuously, whether you know it or not, by platforms whose business model requires your engagement, and by investigators whose job is to use that engagement against you. One of the strangest social features of this life is the management of information within your own family, which operates on an informal don't ask, don't tell policy that everyone understands and no one names out loud. Your mother knows something is wrong with the money. She has done the math on your apparent income versus your apparent lifestyle, and the numbers don't add up, and she is not bad at math. Your siblings might know more specifically. A younger one might look up to you in a way that cost you sleep. An older one might have opinions they've expressed exactly once and then buried, because they understood that the conversation was not going to go the direction they wanted. What families do in most cases is something remarkable. They maintain the surface. They accept the partial explanations. They don't ask the questions they know might produce answers they'd be legally or emotionally obligated to act on. This is not complicity in any meaningful moral sense. It is love operating under conditions of strain, choosing the version of you they can hold on to over the version that would require them to let go. And you know this. You understand it in a way that doesn't require analysis, that lives in you as a kind of background hum of debt you don't know how to repay and can't discharge by stopping, because stopping has its own costs that also feel impossible. The family dynamic around money is particularly layered. You can provide things. This is real and it matters. Rent when there's a shortfall, groceries when the end of the month gets thin, school supplies for a sibling, the phone bill that was going to lapse. These contributions are concrete. They're visible. They produce real relief in real people's lives in the short term. They also create a dependency that becomes part of the structure holding this life in place. The family, which in theory might be a motivating force toward a different path, is also, in practice, sometimes a reason the path continues. Because the contributions matter, because the alternative path doesn't produce contributions at the same speed, because stopping means the shortfalls come back. Your mother specifically represents a particular dimension of this. The specific guilt of knowing that she knows, or suspects, or has decided not to know, because knowing would be worse, is a weight that people in this life describe as among the heaviest they carry. She's the person who raised you, who was there before any of this existed, who remembers who you were before the math of this particular life became the math of your actual life. The version of you that exists in her memory is still present, somewhere, as a reference point against which the current version is constantly being measured. You feel that measurement. You don't always address it. Sometimes you address it with money. which is a wrong answer that works for a while. The younger sibling who looks up to you is a different and more urgent problem. The cultural gravity of an older sibling who appears successful, whose success in visible ways, whose operation you can observe up close, is powerful in the specific way that proximity to something dangerous is always more powerful than abstract warnings about it. You know what this looks like from the outside because you've been the younger sibling watching someone older, and you know how that watching works, what questions it produces, what path it suggests. The responsibility you feel toward keeping this particular sibling out is real, and also sometimes undermined by the same structural forces that brought you in, because the economics and the neighborhood haven't changed just because you want different outcomes for someone you love. The debt of unspoken knowledge is one of the stranger features of this life's effect on close relationships. You know that the people you love know or suspect more than they say. They know that you know they know, and the conversation that would acknowledge this shared reality is never quite had, because having it would require someone to break a surface that everyone has agreed without speaking about it to maintain. This is not dishonesty in the conventional sense. It is a form of protective fiction that both parties maintain because the alternative produces consequences that nobody in the room is prepared to manage. So the surface holds, and underneath it, the unspoken things accumulate the way sediment accumulates, slowly, invisibly, until you realize one day that the weight of what isn't said has changed the shape of the relationship entirely. The version of this that breaks the surface is usually a crisis, an arrest, an overdose too close to home, a moment when the fiction becomes impossible to maintain because the consequence has arrived in the room and demanded to be acknowledged. These moments are devastating in a specific way because they make visible everything that was known but not said, and the thing that was protecting everyone from having to deal with it has been removed. What's left is the relationship as it actually is, which is the relationship that was always there underneath the surface, waiting. Some relationships survive this with more honesty and more strength than the protected version had. Some don't survive it at all. Both outcomes are real. When you're operating inside this market, you have a perspective that public health researchers and policy analysts mostly don't. You see what fentanyl does to a neighborhood in real time, from the inside. You see the person who used to be functional, who used to hold a job and show up for their kids, and you watch that person's arc over months and their arc is not upward. You see it happen faster than it happened with older opioids because fentanyl's pharmacology is less forgiving. Its tolerance escalation is steeper, and the window between controlled use and dependence is narrower than almost any other substance in this market. You see what happens to blocks that used to have other things on them. Barbershops, small restaurants, people sitting outside on a summer evenings, when a significant portion of the foot traffic becomes oriented around one activity. The visual vocabulary of a neighborhood with a heavy fentanyl presence is specific and recognizable to anyone who lives in it. The particular kind of stillness that isn't peaceful, the figures in certain doorways at certain hours, the ambulances that stop being remarkable because they come often enough to become background. You are part of that landscape. You helped create it. That knowledge does not translate automatically into the ability or the will to change it, because you also live in it, and you also know that the forces that created the conditions for this market to exist are not forces you have the ability to address by yourself, and probably not by any individual choice you can make. The transformation of a neighborhood under the influence of heavy opioid market activity is not instantaneous. It's gradual and cumulative, and each individual step is small enough to absorb without registering as a turning point, until you look back at a distance, and the accumulation becomes visible. A vacant lot where people used to play basketball, a building that used to have businesses on the ground floor and doesn't anymore, a park that parents stopped bringing kids to, the particular kind of economic withdrawal that follows high visible drug activity. the insurance rates that rise, the businesses that decide the location no longer makes sense, the residents with options who move toward neighborhoods where those options produce more security. This is how neighborhoods hollow out. Not with one dramatic event, but with 1,000 small decisions made by people responding rationally to the conditions of their specific environment. The people who remain, and who have always been the majority even in communities with significant drug market activity, carry a weight that rarely appears in coverage of the opioid crisis. They're the ones who navigated their block every day around the activity they didn't choose and couldn't easily leave, who raised children in the proximity of it, who watched neighbours and family members get drawn into it, who called ambulances, who attended funerals, who organised community meetings and engaged local government and tried to produce change through the channels available to them, while the channels produce limited results. These people are not passive victims of a market that was done to them. They're active resistors of a condition imposed on them by forces considerably larger than their neighbourhood, and their resistance is largely invisible in the public narrative about the opioid crisis, which tends to centre either the individual tragedy or the policy debate rather than the sustained communal effort to survive and maintain dignity inside a crisis that did not ask permission. The ambulance that stops being remarkable is perhaps the most precise description of what sustained exposure to overdose mortality does to the people who witness it over time. The human brain is designed to adapt to its environment, which is a remarkable survival mechanism, and also, in this context, a tragedy. You stop registering the sirens. They become background. A death in your radius is processed and filed, and you keep moving, because the alternative is to be paralysed by a frequency of loss that doesn't allow for sustained paralysis. This is not callousness. This is a coping mechanism that serves survival. It is also something that does damage over time in ways that are not always immediately visible. The cultural image of the drug dealer as someone who never touches the product is partly a real operational principle and partly a myth. The rule exists and is repeated sincerely. You don't use what you sell. Using creates dependency. Dependency creates desperation. Desperation creates bad decisions. Bad decisions create vulnerability. Vulnerability creates exposure. Exposure creates prison or death. The logic is airtight. The reality is that it breaks down with some regularity, particularly in an environment where fentanyl is physically present every day, where the people around you are using it, where stress is constant and non-pharmaceutical coping mechanisms are limited, and the thing that reliably blunts the specific texture of this particular anxiety is right there. Not everyone in this market uses. Many don't, and the ones who have been doing this for years and have watched what happens to people who do tend to be genuinely disciplined about separation. But some do, and when that happens, the spiral is specific and fast. Because fentanyl dependence at the level of someone who has access to supply is not the same as fentanyl dependence for someone who has to budget it. The access is the variable that changes everything. The tolerance climbs. The supply that was profit becomes cost. The business model that was sustaining you starts consuming you. It is one of the more quietly terrible ironies available in this particular life. The pharmacology of fentanyl addiction is worth understanding here, because it clarifies why the just don't start principle, while correct, is not as simple as it sounds in the environment where it needs to be applied. Opioid dependence develops through the brain's neuroadaptation to the presence of the drug. With repeated exposure, the brain downregulates its own production of endorphins and adjusts the sensitivity of opioid receptors. The brain essentially rebuilds itself around the drug's presence, so that the absence of the drug produces a state that feels acutely wrong. The withdrawal that the brain has now calibrated as its baseline in the absence of opioids. This process happens faster with fentanyl than with longer-acting opioids, because fentanyl's short half-life means the brain cycles through peaks and troughs rapidly, accelerating the adaptation. It is possible to develop physical dependence on fentanyl in days of regular use, not weeks. Days. This is not a pharmacological exaggeration. It is the specific feature of this molecule that makes it so dangerous in the illicit market, and why you don't use what you sell is a rule that requires constant active discipline rather than a one-time decision. For someone who becomes dependent while operating in this market, the experience is isolating in a specific way, because the usual social supports for addiction, family, friends, community, are also people who would be devastated or endangered by the knowledge of what's happening. You can't tell your mother, you can't tell your friends outside the market because they'd be alarmed in ways that create problems. You can't access treatment easily because treatment requires documentation, and the documentation creates exposure. The particular trap of addiction inside drug dealing is that the structures that might otherwise support recovery are blocked by the same legal exposure that shapes every other aspect of this life. You're sick in a way you can't tell anyone about, using a substance you can't stop accessing, because it's right there, inside an operation that is already under pressure from every other direction. The end of this story, when it ends this way, is not usually dramatic, it's gradual. The operation becomes less reliable because you're less reliable. Customers notice the inconsistency and migrate elsewhere. The money starts moving in the wrong direction. The people around you who know something has changed either try to help, which creates its own complicated dynamics, or distance themselves, because the risks of proximity to someone who is both dealing and using and visibly deteriorating are significant, and they can see them clearly even if you can't. By the time it becomes undeniable, the situation has usually already produced consequences that will take years to undo, assuming they can be undone at all. Here is a fact that does not get communicated clearly in most media coverage of the drug war. The federal sentencing guidelines for drug distribution involving fentanyl are severe, in a way that is difficult to fully conceptualize until you see them applied to a specific person's specific life. Federal mandatory minimums for fentanyl trafficking trigger based on weight. 40 grams of a mixture or substance containing a detectable amount of fentanyl is enough to trigger a 10-year mandatory minimum. 400 grams triggers a mandatory life sentence. These are not the sentences that get handed down after judicial discretion and consideration of individual circumstances. These are the floors, the minimum. The starting point before a judge has said a single word about your background, your family, your remorse, your prospects for rehabilitation, or any other factor that might in any other context be considered relevant to a proportionate punishment. And critically, mixture weight is not the weight of pure fentanyl. It's the weight of the fentanyl plus whatever it was mixed with. The cutting agents, the binding agents in the pills, the total volume of the substance, not the active compound. Which means that cases involving relatively modest retail operations, when weighed out, sometimes hit thresholds that produce decades of mandatory prison time for people who are not kingpins, who are not cartel members, who are not architects of anything larger than their own small and desperate economic arrangement. The federal prosecution of drug cases involves a resource disparity between the government and the individual defendant that is difficult to overstate. The DEA, the FBI, and the United States Attorney's offices have substantial investigative budgets, experienced career prosecutors, and the institutional weight of the federal government behind every case they bring. The defendant in a federal drug case typically has either a public defender, who is often talented and dedicated but is carrying a caseload of 60 or 70 or more cases simultaneously with limited investigative resources, or a private attorney who costs money that is expensive to document as legitimate. The quality of legal representation is genuinely uneven in ways that produce uneven outcomes for people facing the same underlying charges. Plea agreements resolve the majority of federal drug cases. The statistics vary by district but consistently show that somewhere between 90 and 97% of federal criminal cases resolve through plea rather than trial. This is not primarily because most defendants are guilty beyond reasonable doubt of everything charged, though some are. It is because the risk calculation of going to trial, when mandatory minimums are in play, produces outcomes that most defendants and their attorneys cannot rationally recommend. The government charges what it can prove or credibly threaten to prove. The defendant faces a choice between a negotiated plea that might produce a sentence of 5 years or 8 years, and a trial that, if lost, produces a sentence of 20 years or 30 years. The mathematical pressure toward accepting a plea is enormous even when there are genuine legal questions about the charges. The plea agreement resolves the case efficiently for the system and produces a sentence that is calibrated to the information the defendant provides rather than to the severity of their individual conduct. The prison experience itself is beyond the scope of what can be adequately addressed in a single segment, but its broad contours are worth noting. Federal prisons are geographically distributed in ways that often mean you're serving your sentence hundreds of miles from your family in a facility far from anyone who can visit you with any regularity. The social isolation of incarceration, compounded by geographic distance, is a significant feature of its punitive weight. The specific conditions of serving time in a federal facility for a drug offense include the company of people serving time for other federal offenses in an environment that is managed differently from state prison but not uniformly better. The programs available for substance use treatment, for education, for vocational training are real in some facilities and nominal in others. You come out different. You come out with a record that follows you into every subsequent job application, housing application, and social interaction where it becomes relevant. The sentence does not end on the release date. Let's be clear about something. The competitive dynamics in street-level drug markets are not primarily organized around brands or market share in the way that business school language might suggest. They're organized around the most immediate and personal possible stakes, which is to say, your income and your safety, and the relationship between those two things when they come into conflict with someone else's income and safety in a shared geography. The arrival of a competitor in your customer network is not abstract. It's usually someone you know, or someone who knows someone you know, and the fact that you know them does not make the situation less threatening. It sometimes makes it more so, because you have specific knowledge of their capabilities and they of yours. The negotiation that follows can take many forms. Sometimes it settles into an informal understanding about division of territory or clientele. Sometimes it doesn't. The capacity for escalation is always present, and the specific features of fentanyl markets add a particular wrinkle. The product is so potent and the overdose rates are so high that customer bases churn. Regular customers die, enter treatment, get incarcerated. New ones appear. This means the competition for a sustainable customer network is ongoing and cannot be resolved once and maintained. It requires constant attention, constant maintenance, and a constant awareness of who else is trying to occupy the same space. The market dynamics of fentanyl specifically have changed the competitive landscape in ways that differ from earlier opioid markets. Because fentanyl is dramatically cheaper to produce than heroin, a kilogram of illicit fentanyl costs a fraction of what a kilogram of heroin costs at the wholesale level. The profit margins at each level of the supply chain are different, and this has produced a kind of market saturation in some cities where the number of retail-level operators exceeds what the customer base can support. The result is a competitive environment with more participants and lower margins per participant, which creates more friction, more volatility, and more of the dangerous dynamics that emerge when the competitive equilibrium is unstable. Price competition in this market takes a specific form. Undercutting your competitor's price is a tool, but it's not the primary competitive variable. Reliability matters more. Availability matters more. The specific relationship between dealer and regular customer, the trust that this person's product is consistent, that they respond quickly, that they don't short the quantity, is what produces loyalty in this market. A customer who trusts their source will pay a modest premium for that trust, because the alternative of an unknown source with unknown quality produces a risk that is not abstract. Loyalty in the fentanyl market is bought with consistency, and it can be lost with a single serious failure of quality or availability. The emotional texture of competition in this context is something that academic market analysis doesn't fully capture. You grew up with some of these people. You might have been friends before you were competitors. The transition from friendship to competition to potential threat is not a neutral business process. It's a social rupture that happens inside a set of relationships that were already navigating the strains of this environment. The person who is now encroaching on your customer base was at your birthday party 3 years ago. That history doesn't disappear. It just gets filed under a different heading and becomes part of the complicated emotional ledger that this life keeps building without asking your permission. The pricing competition that develops between rival operators is also a race toward the bottom that doesn't serve anyone in the market well. When two suppliers are competing for the same customer base, the natural response is to compete on price. Lowering price means lowering margin. Lowering margin at a retail operation that already runs on thin margins means either reducing volume until the economics stabilize, which means losing market share, or maintaining volume by reducing product quality, which means cutting more aggressively and produces worse product. The customer who benefits from the price competition may not be aware that the quality competition is happening on the other side of the equation, and the consequence of discovering that the product is worse lands not on the competing dealers but on the person who used it. There is also the exhaustion factor in market competition that doesn't appear in any business school analysis. The energy required to maintain vigilance against a competitor, to monitor their movements and their customer interactions, to respond to their pricing and availability, is energy that is not available for anything else. The cumulative weight of this is not visible from the outside. It lives in the body, in the eyes, in the particular quality of someone who's been awake inside a difficult situation for longer than sleep can repair. Competition makes everything cost more in every currency that matters, and the bill comes due in ways that are rarely visible until the damage is already done. On a day when nothing goes wrong, when every transaction completes without incident, when no one overdoses and no one's number shows up on a news alert, and the phone doesn't produce any messages that require difficult management, the feeling is not relief. Or it's relief that metabolizes within hours into something that functions less like comfort and more like waiting. You've gotten good at waiting. Waiting is what this is, in some fundamental sense. You're in a state of deferred consequence, doing something today that will cost you later in some form, and the gap between the doing and the paying is the only space in which normal life is permitted to happen. So on the good days, you eat. You spend time with people. You watch something on your phone. You sleep without waking at 3 a.m. to check the door. You experience something that looks a lot like ordinary life, and if you don't look at it too closely, it almost passes for ordinary life. The problem with this is that it works well enough that it becomes a reason to continue, which is the most effective trap the situation offers. Not the money, not even the inertia. But the good days, which are indistinguishable on the surface from the good days that people living completely different lives are also having, and which cost you things you won't be fully able to count until later. The specific pleasure of a quiet day in this life is intense in proportion to its rarity. food tastes good, the television show that you're watching is actually landing. The conversation with someone you care about doesn't have any of the subtext that usually lives in conversations, because today there's nothing immediately wrong. The ordinariness of this, the flat-footed normalcy of a Tuesday afternoon without incident, is not something you can explain to someone who has never experienced its specific value. It's the value of water after thirst, of warmth after cold. The baseline of ordinary experience perceived as luxury. The psychological literature on people who operate in chronic high-stress environments describes something called positive anticipation disruption, which is the way sustained threat exposure interferes with the brain's capacity to derive full pleasure from positive experiences, because the threat monitoring systems remain active even in the absence of threat. You're having a good day, but the part of your brain assigned to watching for problems has not stood down because there is no protocol by which it stands down. It watches. The good day happens around the watching, inside it, despite it. You enjoy what you can enjoy in the space that leaves. The relationships that are possible on good days are real and worth preserving. The friend who doesn't know the specifics of your life and doesn't ask. The family member who just wants to spend time with you. The moments of genuine laughter, genuine ease, genuine presence that exist inside this life, the way they exist inside every life. Because human beings produce those moments regardless of circumstances, because the capacity for connection and pleasure is not suspended by context. These moments are real. They matter. They're also part of what makes this hard to leave, because leaving means risking the version of these relationships that exist now, in the current arrangement, for a different version that might be better in the long run, and would certainly be different in the short run, in ways that are hard to predict and frightening to imagine. The good days are a reason to stay, and a preview of what staying will eventually cost, both of those things at the same time. The ordinariness of the good day is also a kind of grief, if you let yourself feel it fully enough, because it shows you what is possible in the spaces between the other things. The person you are on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, eating something good and watching something funny and not checking the door, that person is real. That person is also the person who goes back to the phone tomorrow and the day after. The relationship between those two versions is not a contradiction. It's the specific human capacity to hold incompatible things in the same life and keep moving forward. But the good day makes the incompatibility visible in a way that the busy operational days don't. On the busy days, there's no time to see it clearly. On the good days, you see it. And you make the same choice you've been making, and you carry that into the next busy day. The choice isn't made in a dramatic moment with a clear before and after. It's made in the accumulation of ordinary days, each one a small and unremarkable decision to continue, until continuing becomes who you are in a way that feels harder and harder to step outside of. This is how most things that are hard to stop actually work, not with a single dramatic decision, with 1,000 ordinary ones. Every person doing this at the street level has thought about stopping. That's not speculation. The thought is available frequently, often at 3 a.m, or in the aftermath of something that frightened them, or in the quiet after a customer they knew dies. The thought is there. The gap between the thought and the action is where the actual complexity lives. Stopping requires solving several simultaneous problems, none of which are solved by the decision itself. There's the income replacement problem, which is real and immediate in a way that a decision to stop does not address. There's the social network problem, because the people you're closest to are often people who are also inside this world, and leaving a market doesn't automatically leave a social context. There's the debt problem, if you owe money to anyone above you in the supply chain, because that obligation doesn't disappear because you've decided to be done. There's the exposure problem. Everything you've done is already done, and stopping doesn't erase the evidence that exists, It just stops the production of new evidence, which is valuable but not a clean slate. And there's the psychological problem, which is the hardest to name but perhaps the most durable. A person who has been operating in this environment for any significant amount of time has reorganized themselves around its demands in ways that don't easily come undone with a decision, however sincere. The income replacement problem is not trivial and deserves more serious engagement than it typically receives in conversations about drug market exit. The legal labour market available to someone in their early 20s with limited formal education, no professional network, and in some cases a prior record from an earlier arrest, is not a market that produces instant income at the level required to sustain an existing standard of living or to address existing financial obligations. Entry-level jobs at current minimum wage do not close the gap. They're a start, but a start that requires sustained investment in a future payoff, while the immediate costs are present and the immediate income is inadequate. The practical math of this transition is genuinely difficult, and people who dismiss it as an excuse rather than engaging with it as a structural problem are describing a different obstacle than the one being described. The social network problem operates through a mechanism that is well documented in the addiction recovery literature, but applies here beyond addiction specifically. Your social environment shapes your behavior. The people around you, the norms of your immediate community, the activities and expectations of your social circle, all pull toward continuation of current patterns. Leaving the market without leaving the social context that is organized around the market is extremely difficult to sustain. The people who successfully exit this life generally describe significant social disruption as part of the process. Moving to a different neighborhood, losing or intentionally distancing from relationships that are incompatible with the new path, finding new social anchors that organize around different activities and expectations. This is not metaphor. It's sociology, and it describes real losses that people experience as real grief, not as a straightforward upgrade to a better life. The transition period, whenever it begins, is defined by the specific tension of being between two states, no longer fully inside the old life but not yet established in the new one. This is the most dangerous interval in terms of recidivism, not because the person has changed their mind, but because the gaps in the new life are real and the known structure of the old life is available. The people who make it through this interval successfully generally have some combination of external anchor: a person, a job, a program, a legal obligation that creates accountability during the period when the internal motivation alone is not sufficient to hold the new path in place. This is not weakness. It is the normal human need for structure during periods of significant change applied to an unusually difficult transition. Naloxone is a medication that reverses opioid overdose. It works by blocking opioid receptors with enough affinity to temporarily displace fentanyl, restoring normal breathing in someone who has stopped breathing. It's available over the counter in most states. It costs a few dollars in some contexts and is distributed free in others. It has no potential for abuse. It cannot harm someone who is not overdosing. It has no effect at all if opioids aren't present. It is, in the clearest possible pharmaceutical terms, a pure life-saving tool with no downside. The relationship between street-level dealers and naloxone is complicated in ways that tell you something interesting about how these things work in practice. Some carry it, some distribute it to regular customers, either because they care about them as people, or because a dead customer is a problem that comes back to them in ways that living customers don't. Some are provided it by harm reduction organizations that operate without judgment in neighborhoods where the need is high. Some won't touch it on the grounds that its presence signals something about their product that creates legal exposure. The availability of naloxone in the 2020s has saved tens of thousands of lives, by conservative estimates. This is not controversial in public health. It is in the political sphere still occasionally treated as controversial, which tells you something about the gap between public health logic and drug war logic that has defined American policy for over 50 years. Harm reduction as a philosophy extends beyond naloxone to a broader framework that prioritizes keeping people alive and healthier over demanding abstinence as a precondition for receiving help. Needle exchanges, which provide clean injection equipment to people who inject drugs, reduce HIV and hepatitis C transmission dramatically. They also serve as points of contact between people who use drugs and health and social services, creating opportunities for people to access treatment when they're ready, rather than only when they've exhausted themselves through compulsory abstinence programs. Supervised consumption sites, which exist in Canada and Europe, and are a subject of significant legal and political controversy in the United States, allow people to use drugs under medical supervision with naloxone immediately available, producing a remarkable outcome. Nobody has died of an overdose inside a supervised consumption facility anywhere that they operate. Fentanyl test strips represent a specific harm reduction tool that addresses the contamination problem directly. They're a small piece of immunoassay paper that, when dipped in a diluted drug sample, indicates the presence or absence of fentanyl. They cost pennies. They can tell a user whether what they have contains fentanyl before they use it, which doesn't solve the hotspot problem but does give a known fentanyl user the ability to calibrate their dose more carefully than they would using a product they assumed was something else. In most states, fentanyl test strips were, until recently, classified as drug paraphernalia, making their distribution illegal under the same laws that criminalize syringes. A wave of state decriminalization efforts has changed this in many jurisdictions in the 2020s, and the public health case for widespread distribution is strong. The harm reduction community operates largely outside the drug enforcement framework, and often in implicit tension with it, serving a population that law enforcement also interacts with but from a different direction. The trust that harm reduction workers build with people who use drugs is built on a specific foundation: unconditional service, no judgment, no law enforcement referral. This trust is operationally essential. Without it, the people most at risk don't access the services. With it, you can reach people in the part of their lives where they're most vulnerable and create the conditions for connection to other services. The harm reduction worker who hands out naloxone and clean supplies and talks to someone about what they're going through is doing something that law enforcement cannot do, and that treatment programs contingent on sobriety cannot do. They're showing up for the person as they are right now, and that contact is sometimes the thing that eventually leads somewhere different. Here's a thing worth sitting with. The person selling fentanyl on a corner in a mid-sized American city in 2022 is not the architect of the opioid crisis. The architect of the opioid crisis had offices in Connecticut. They gave presentations to physicians that were deliberately misleading about the addiction potential of OxyContin. They hired sales representatives to promote a Schedule II narcotic, using marketing materials that described addiction as a myth. They funded patient advocacy organizations designed to normalize the idea that under-medicated pain was a national emergency in need of a particular pharmaceutical solution. They made billions of dollars. Most of them did not go to prison. The system that followed, the crackdown on prescription opioids that left a generation of dependent people without a medical supply, the pivot to heroin, the pivot to fentanyl, the escalating potency as cartels competed on price per dose there, is direct and traceable consequence of those decisions made at the top of a legal and well-capitalized enterprise. The street-level dealer exists in the wreckage of that history. This is not a moral argument for anything. It is a structural observation about how demand and supply interact in an illegal market, and about who ends up facing mandatory minimums and who ends up on a Forbes list. The history of OxyContin's introduction and marketing is well documented and constitutes one of the more remarkable corporate crime stories in recent American history. Purdue Pharma, controlled by the Sackler family, launched OxyContin in 1996 with a marketing strategy that aggressively promoted the drug as safer and less addictive than existing opioids, a claim that was not supported by adequate evidence and was pursued despite internal knowledge of the addiction potential. The FDA approved the drug with labeling that described a delayed absorption mechanism that was claimed to reduce addiction potential. That mechanism was inadequate, the drug was crushable, it was highly addictive, and it was deployed through a marketing operation that paid physicians to prescribe it. Saturated pain management and primary care with sales representatives whose bonuses depended on prescription volume, and targeted communities and regions with high rates of pain-related disability. Rural Appalachian communities, communities with high rates of physical labor injury, in ways that produced an overdose epidemic whose demographics map onto the marketing priorities of the 1990s almost exactly. The crackdown on opioid prescribing that followed the public acknowledgement of the epidemic beginning around 2010 had a predictable effect on a population that had developed opioid dependence. Cut off from a pharmaceutical supply, people with opioid dependence, whose brains had reorganized themselves around the drug's presence, needed an alternative. The alternative available to them was the black market. Heroin, historically the black market opioid of last resort, surged in communities that had never had significant heroin use. Then fentanyl entered the heroin supply and began replacing it because fentanyl is cheaper, more potent, and easier to conceal. Then fentanyl became the supply rather than an adulterant, and then the overdose rate climbed from a crisis to something that had no adequate descriptive language in American public health for its scale. The people who died in this sequence, and the people who died supplying the demand that the sequence created, are connected to each other by a chain of causation that starts with decisions made in boardrooms and in FDA offices and in congressional committee rooms. This is not a retroactive excuse for anything. It is a description of cause and effect that is accurate and that has policy implications, which is probably why it is not as prominently featured in the public conversation about the opioid crisis as it should be. You are not an abstraction in this story. You are a person who ended up at the bottom of a supply chain that was created by the interaction of catastrophic pharmaceutical marketing, inadequate regulatory oversight, and an enforcement-first drug policy that had been failing since it was implemented. You didn't architect any of that. You inherited it. So here you are, still breathing. That's something. You've just spent the last few hours inside one of the most dangerous and least understood lives in modern America, and somewhere along the way, if this went the way it was supposed to, you stopped seeing a type and started seeing a person. A specific, complicated, structurally trapped, occasionally funny, frequently exhausted, genuinely human person who woke up in a neighborhood that didn't offer him many doors, picked the one that was open, and walked through it the way people have always walked through open doors without a complete accounting of what was on the other side. That's worth sitting with for a moment before you go to sleep. Because the easy version of this story, the version that requires the least from the listener, is the one where the dealer is the villain, where the problem has a face and the face belongs to someone who made a choice and is now living with the consequences and deserves whatever follows. That version is tidy. It's satisfying in the particular way that clear moral assignments are satisfying, the way a diagnosis feels better than uncertainty, even when the diagnosis is bad news. We are wired for clear assignments. Villain, victim, bystander. It makes the world navigable. But the honest version of this story doesn't offer that tidiness, and you know it, because you listened to 30 chapters of the honest version. The honest version has a person who was 17 and poor and surrounded by a world that had already made certain calculations about his future before he made any of his own. The honest version has a pharmaceutical company with a legal address and a board of directors and a marketing team that deliberately obscured the addiction potential of a Schedule II narcotic for profit, and that companies' decisions are directly traceable to the crisis that put this person on the corner you've spent this evening watching him stand on. The honest version has a policy apparatus that for 50 years has responded to the human catastrophe of addiction primarily with incarceration, and has measured its success in arrests rather than in lives, and has produced by that measurement the highest overdose death rate in American history. The honest version is not tidy. It is large and systemic and implicates people who will never stand on a corner and will never face a mandatory minimum and will never appear in a segment of a documentary about the drug war. But here's the thing about the person on the corner. He is not a symbol. He is not a policy problem waiting for the correct intervention. He is not a cautionary tale, though his story contains caution. He is a person who, on the good days, ate something that tasted good, and watched something that made him laugh, and felt, for a few hours, the specific relief of a Tuesday afternoon without incident. A person who worried about his mother and felt the weight of his younger sibling's gaze and carried, somewhere underneath all the operational noise, a version of himself that remembered what it was like before the math of this particular life became the math of his actual life. A person who thought more than once at 3 a.m. about stopping. Who held that thought for a while? Who didn't know yet how to make the thought into something larger than itself? There are people who got out. The exits are real. They happen quietly, without headlines, in the gap between one life and whatever comes next, built out of whatever materials were available. A child, a close call, a person who showed up at the right moment and offered something that made the next step feel possible. Those exits don't look like movie endings. They look like a Tuesday afternoon that extends into a Wednesday, and then a Thursday, and then a month, and then a year, and then something that can be called a life that doesn't require the management of consequences that are always one wrong call away from arriving at the door. We spent this evening with someone who hadn't found that exit yet, or hadn't taken it yet. The distinction matters. The exit was always there somewhere. They usually are. In 2023, more than 112,000 Americans died of drug overdoses. Most of them were not dealers. Most of them were people whose bodies had become chemically dependent on a substance that was initially prescribed to them or introduced to them by someone they trusted, or that they reached for in a moment of pain that had no other pharmaceutical management available to it. They were nurses and construction workers and teenagers at parties, and grandparents who had been managing chronic pain for years. They were people whose obituaries did not mention how they died, because the families were protecting something, a name, a memory, a version of a person that predated the addiction. They had names. They had specific people who loved them. They are the reason this story matters, not as a policy document, but as a human accounting of what happens when the gap between what a society provides and what its people need becomes wide enough to swallow whole generations whole. The person who supplied some of those deaths is not uncomplicated. He made choices that had consequences that he carries, that accounting is real and is not erased by the structural argument. Both things are true at the same time, the way things in the real world are true. The individual decision and the system that shaped it, layered over each other, inseparable, equally real. What you can take from this, as you let the night settle around you, and your body gets heavy and your breathing slows, is this. The next time this subject comes up in your life, in the news, in a conversation, in a statistic that flashes past you on a screen, You will know something that most people don't know. You will know what a day in that life actually costs. You will know that the face attached to the crisis has a 3 a.m, has a mother, has a thought about stopping that comes and goes and hasn't yet found solid ground. You will know that the story is older and larger and more structurally determined than the version that fits on a bumper sticker or a campaign mailer. You will know that 112,000 deaths is not a number. It is 112,000 people, each of whom had a specific Tuesday afternoon that meant something to someone. That knowledge doesn't resolve anything. It doesn't produce a policy solution or a verdict or a simple emotional response you can walk away from cleanly. What it produces is something rarer and more durable than resolution. It produces the specific discomfort of seeing clearly, which is the only starting point for anything that eventually resembles change. The night is quiet now. Whatever's outside your window is doing whatever it does at this hour, and you are here, horizontal, breathing, safe in the particular and underappreciated luxury of a night with no doors to check, and no phone to watch, and no math running in the background that you can't turn off. Take a breath, and let the weight of it go for tonight. It will still be there tomorrow, the stories always are, but for now, the only job you have is to rest, sleep well,